Hello, I'm Daniel Meyer, Artistic Director of the Westmoreland Symphony Orchestra, and it is a great pleasure to be with you and celebrate our upcoming opening weekend with the Westmoreland Symphony Orchestra. It's also a great pleasure to be spending some time here with Stephen Banks, who is our guest artist on the opening weekend. First of all, Stephen, welcome. We are thrilled to be having you as our opening weekend artist. And first, I thought we might start a little bit with an origin story and just talk a little bit about your beginnings with the saxophone. Do you remember the first time that you ever heard somebody play the saxophone? And do you remember the moment when you thought, oh, gee, maybe I'd like to do that?
I don't remember the very first time that I ever heard a saxophone. But I learned sort of later in life, actually, that my father had a soprano saxophone. And apparently he put it in my hands when I was really, really, really young, like way too young to remember. But maybe that's folklore, I don't know. But I remember starting saxophone in middle school, like many people do. My first instrument was piano, and then my first wind instrument was clarinet. But I always wanted to play the saxophone, and I'm sure there are other young musicians that can identify with having to go to band and really wanting to play an instrument, but your band director says we already have too many of those. And so that happened. So then I ended up having to play the clarinet, which I'm now really glad that I do play the clarinet and did play the clarinet. But soon after that, my mom sort of allowed me to cheat the system a little bit and rented a tenor saxophone for me to play on at home. And then I kept it going. And I sort of got serious about the saxophone in high school when I went to the North Carolina School of the Arts and studied with a great teacher there.
Yeah, I mean, usually that's what it takes is, an initial exposure to somebody or someone who fosters that love of music. And obviously, you were forging your own path. Now, of course, the track for saxophone is often in wind bands or wind ensembles or marching bands. And of course, there are plenty of opportunities in the jazz world for sax players. Tell us a little bit about what it's like to develop a life and a career around the classical, the quote unquote classical repertoire with the saxophone.
Yeah, I'm still figuring that out. I can say that it's very exciting because um, everything that many instrumentalists have in terms of repertoire and performance practice, um, I don't have it to the same degree that they do. And so in many ways, I'm trying to cultivate what it means to be a classical saxophonist and cultivate the repertoire, decide which types of transcriptions I think work really well, instruments for other or pieces for other instruments that I could play on the saxophone. But I'm also a composer, and so I write some of my own music for the saxophone that I like to play. And I generally like to write my cadenzas, and so it's a very exciting path. Sometimes it's a little scary because you don't know where you're going sometimes, but it's something that's very fulfilling for me because this repertoire and this way of expressing oneself is so um, near and dear to me that regardless of what instrument I have, I know that I want to do that.
Yeah, and in some ways, you're rather old school in the respect that, if you think about artists like Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, they were all writing music for themselves to play. They
Mm.
realized that the number one exponent of their music was going to be themselves, and they were all virtuosos on their instruments. So that they created repertoire that then they could use as a calling card or use as a means to make music with their friends or create public concerts. So in some ways, you're a bit of a throwback. But I also wanted to ask you, in terms of being a composer, are there particular composers or artists that really resonate with you, and then you find some of their techniques are creeping into your work, or do you just find that it's more about just kind of shutting off the world and trying to create something from scratch?
Mm. That's an interesting question because I've been reflecting on that because sometimes when I write, I'm perplexed by what comes out because it's not always the kind of music that I love to play exactly, but it's what I'm hearing and what I feel like I need to express. So composers like Mozart, are composers that I love to play. It just fills me with so much joy to present that music and to sort of become an actor and to put on my wig in a certain a certain way. um, and I love the romantics. I love the canon of classical music, really. And I also really love a lot of contemporary composers. So um, people like Thomas Addis, and I mean, there's so many. Andrew Norman is a composer that I've really been drawn to recently in the way that he treats form, which is connected to people that came before him, like Sibelius, and so I'm into it all, and I love to learn. And so in the composition process, I often try to just trust myself and allow whatever is going to come out to sort of come out, and it ends up having the influence of all of these composers, while hopefully not, sounding exactly like any of them. And that's the fun part about composition for me.
So let me ask you a practical question. Do you structure your day so that when you wake up, you head straight to the composition table, or do you wait until an idea strikes you and then you make time to write? And of course, you're also learning other pieces in order to perform them on the saxophone. So obviously, there has to be some structure to the way that you organize your day. Do you find that there's any one particular way that you work? And will you be composing while you're here in Greensburg?
I will not be composing while I'm in Greensburg. It usually doesn't work within a day in that way. It's usually like if it's a heavy practice day, then I'm 100% in practicing. And when I'm writing, um, I might be coming up with ideas while I'm in Greensburg. So I might sketch things down. And so when I'm writing, the early process is a little bit um, free form, and it could be on a practice day, whatever. But when I'm actually writing 100%, I also clear my schedule for just writing, sitting at the piano or at the computer, whatever it is. So it's hard for me personally to go back and forth because it feels like I'm using different parts of my brain completely.
Understood. Yeah, and of course, when you have a commission, there is a job to do, right? There's a deadline
Right.
to meet, and of course, the commissioning body, whether it's a chamber music festival or an orchestra, they're waiting for their parts. They need to get the music, and they need to rehearse before you arrive as well. So that's
Right.
all kind of baked into the equation. Well, let's talk a little bit about what you're going to be performing with the Westmoreland Symphony. This is a bit unusual, at least for us, to have something that was written originally for oboe, but played on the soprano saxophone. Tell us a little bit about your love for this particular concerto of Mozart, and what, if any, challenges arise when you're transferring music from the oboe to the soprano sax?
Sure. Well, one funny thing about this piece that actually I sort of identify with as a composer is that Mozart um, wrote this concerto originally for the oboe, and then ended up trying to submit it as a flute concerto later to someone. I guess that was back when people wouldn't have heard it already necessarily.
There's no
So
internet.
yeah, right. So he was being a little bit of a trickster there, which I find to be really funny. So, but that fact alone really made me think, this piece, if he's willing to say, oh, well, let's just put it on this other instrument, I think he is thinking about as the music as the core of the piece, and not necessarily the instrument as the core of the piece. So that made me feel quite good actually about transcribing this piece, and also um, the oboe and the soprano saxophone are some of are the oboe is really the only instrument that I feel really translates super well to the saxophone, because the ranges are pretty much identical. The low range is hard on both the oboe and the saxophone. The mid range, comes out quite well. The high range has a singing quality. So um, there are a lot of synergies between the ways that you would play them. Uh, that makes it really lay quite well on the soprano saxophone. And my love for Mozart actually started with not necessarily this piece, but with an album that this piece was on, and it's Albrecht Myers, who's the uh, one of the oboists in the Berlin Philharmonic. He has a recording of this piece on an album called In Search of Mozart. And I used to listen to that album almost the entire thing every day. I remember in undergrad, I'd wake up and put it on as I was getting ready. It's like, geez, wow, it's a beautiful singing sound. How does he do that? And it was sort of like a pipe dream to me to be able to play music like that one day because I didn't really think I was going to. I didn't know that I was going to ever really play the Mozart concerto, the Mozart oboe concerto with an orchestra, and so it's just always such a treat for me.
Well, Stephen, we aim to make dreams come true. And we're also completely thrilled that you're joining us here at the Westmoreland Symphony. I have to admit that I've had the great pleasure of working with you in the past. With the Erie Philharmonic, we performed music of Ibert and Glazunov, and I thought those made a great pair. But I'm really thrilled to get to investigate this part of your musical personality with our orchestra, and just thrilled that you're going to be joining us on opening night, which also features the music of Anton Bruckner, his fourth symphony, the Romantic Symphony. So first of all, welcome. We're thrilled that you're coming, looking forward to having you play, and really excited to be sharing this unique combination of soprano saxophone with the music of Mozart for our opening night. I'm Daniel Meyer, Artistic Director of the Westmoreland Symphony, and this is Stephen Banks saying thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you soon at the Palace Theater.